All right, let's get right into it because the pattern setting up across the country over the next week is a real 1-2 punch. We've got a stretch of severe storm chances working through the plains in the southeast in the short term, and right behind it, a serious heat dome that's about to take over a huge chunk of the lower 48. This isn't a minor warm-up. We're talking widespread dangerous heat spreading from the southern and central plains up into the Midwest and South as we head into next week. And it's happening at the same time the atmosphere is still squeezing out rounds of thunderstorms in a few key corridors. So let's break down exactly where, exactly when, and exactly how intense this is going to get. Right now, the big driver in our pattern is a sprawling ridge of high pressure that's been anchoring itself over the western and central U.S. That ridge is the reason the Southwest has been dealing with monsoon moisture and repeated rounds of thunderstorms, and it's also the mechanism that's about to send temperatures climbing hard across the plains. High pressure ridges work like a lid. They trap hot air underneath them, they suppress cloud cover so more sunshine reaches the ground, and they steer storm systems around their edges instead of letting them move straight through. That's exactly what's happening here. The core of the heat is going to sit and strengthen under this ridge, while the fringes of it become the battleground for thunderstorm activity. For today and into the weekend, keep an eye on a few different zones. The southeast is going to keep seeing chances for showers and thunderstorms, some of which could turn strong to marginally severe, especially where a stalled boundary is sitting across the region. That kind of setup, a boundary that just parks itself and doesn't move, tends to produce repeated rounds of heavy rain over the same areas, which raises the risk of localized flash flooding rather than a single fast-moving line of storms. If you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the broader southeast this weekend, that's the story to watch. Not just isolated storms, but the potential for training thunderstorms that dump rain on the same corridor multiple times. At the same time, out toward the southwest and into the Intermountain West, monsoon moisture is going to keep feeding daily rounds of thunderstorms. This is pretty typical for late August, but it's worth flagging because these storms can produce localized flash flooding in the desert southwest, especially in areas that don't handle heavy rain. Well, canyon terrain, burn scars, and low-lying washes that can go from dry to raging in a matter of minutes. If you're out hiking or camping in that region over the next several days, this is exactly the kind of pattern where you want to know the terrain around you and have an exit plan if storms build overhead. Up across the northern tier, we've got a different story entirely. A wavy frontal boundary tied to low pressure systems moving through southern and western Canada is going to keep dipping into the northern plains and eventually work into the east central U.S. Where that front interacts with warm, humid, unstable air sitting nearby, we could see some strong to locally severe thunderstorms fire up, mainly focused on the central and northern plains through the first half of next week. Damaging wind gusts are the primary concern with any of these storms, along with some large hail. The tornado threat with this setup looks low, but not zero, especially if we get any discrete supercells forming ahead of the main line before storms grow upscale into a broader cluster. Now let's talk about the heat, because this is genuinely the headline story of the next 7 to 10 days. As we move through this weekend and into the beginning of next week, that dominant ridge of high pressure is going to expand and shift eastward, and dangerous, broad-based heat is going to spread from the southern and central plains into the Midwest and South. We're talking about a wide swath of the country, from Texas and Oklahoma up through Kansas, Missouri, and into the Ohio Valley, all seeing temperatures climb well above normal for this time of year. In the core of the heat dome, afternoon highs are likely to push into the upper 90s to around 110 degrees in the hardest hit spots across the southern plains. And that kind of heat sticking around for multiple consecutive days is exactly the setup that leads to heat-related illness, especially for anyone without reliable air conditioning or anyone working outdoors. One of the details that makes this particular heat event more dangerous than a typical hot spell is the lack of overnight relief. When high pressure is this strong and skies stay mostly clear, temperatures don't drop back down much after sunset. That means less time for your body to recover from daytime heat stress before the next hot day starts all over again. Meteorologists and public health officials both flag this as one of the biggest risk factors in prolonged heat events because it's not just the peak daytime number that matters, it's the cumulative strain of several days in a row without a real cool down at night. If you're in the zone getting hit hardest, that's the southern plains into the Mid-South and Ohio Valley. This is the kind of stretch where checking in on elderly neighbors, making sure pets have shade and water, and rescheduling strenuous outdoor activity for early morning actually matters. As we push into the middle of next week, the heat dome is forecast to broaden even further, expanding its reach into the Midwest and South more completely, with widespread hazardous heat affecting a huge population base. Cities across the Ohio Valley, the Mid-South, and the Central and Southern Plains are all going to be dealing with high heat index values. meaning the combination of actual air temperature and humidity will make it feel even hotter than the thermometer says. In more humid zones, like the Ohio Valley and parts of the southeast, that gap between actual temperature and feels like temperature could be significant. So don't be surprised if you see heat index values considerably higher than the raw air temperature on any given afternoon. Meanwhile, while all of this heat is building and spreading, storm systems are still going to be riding along the periphery of that ridge. Disturbances moving out of the Rockies and into the plains and upper Midwest are going to keep firing up rounds of showers and thunderstorms, particularly across the central and southern high plains, where forecasters are watching closely through the first half of next week for stronger storms capable of producing damaging winds. Anywhere that gets hit repeatedly by these storm clusters could also see enough rain add up to cause localized flash flooding, even in a pattern that's otherwise dominated by heat and dry conditions elsewhere. Let's shift over to the tropics for a moment, because there is active tropical development happening right now that's worth tracking. Tropical Storm Dolly is a named system currently being monitored in the Atlantic Basin. As of the latest advisories, Dolly is a relatively weak system, and it's dealing with unfavorable conditions, mainly stronger wind shear, which makes it harder for a tropical system to organize and strengthen. Wind shear essentially tears at a storm structure from the top down, disrupting the process a tropical system needs to intensify. So as long as that shear stays in place, Dolly's odds of becoming a major concern stay fairly low. That said, this is still worth watching, rather than dismissing outright. Some longer-range model guidance shows a track that could eventually bring the system closer to the Bahamas or Florida, and if Dolly manages to hold together long enough to reach an environment with less wind shear, there is a scenario where it strengthens more than currently expected. Right now, though, the more likely outcome based on available guidance is a system that struggles against shear, gradually weakens or stays disorganized as it approaches the Lesser Antilles, and ends up delivering mostly rain rather than a significant wind or storm surge threat. If you're anywhere in the Caribbean or along the southeast coast, this is a keep an eye on it situation rather than a take immediate action situation. But that can change quickly with tropical systems, so it's worth checking back on updated forecasts rather than assuming today's read holds for the whole week. Stepping back to the bigger seasonal picture, this fits into a broader pattern we've seen play out repeatedly this summer, where a dominant heat dome parks itself over a large chunk of the country, shifts gradually from west to east or south to north, depending on the exact orientation of the ridge, and forces storm systems to ride along its northern and western edges, rather than pushing straight through the core of the heat. We've already seen a version of this pattern show up multiple times this season, with the ridge first focusing on the west before shifting toward the Midwest, and now this next round pushing hazardous heat from the plains into the South and Ohio Valley. Looking further out, toward the back half of the 2-week outlook, there are some early signals worth mentioning, while being upfront that confidence this far out is limited. Longer-range model guidance has hinted at the possibility of a pattern change taking hold once we get closer to the second week of September, potentially bringing a stronger cold front through a good chunk of the country and finally breaking the grip of this heat. If that verifies, it would mark a real transition toward more typical early autumn weather, with cooler air and probably a more active, severe weather setup as that front interacts with the lingering warmth and humidity in its path. But again, this is 2 weeks out, which in forecasting terms is right at the edge of reliable predictability, so treat it as a trend to watch rather than a locked-in forecast. Let's talk about what this all means depending on where you live, because the impacts are genuinely different depending on which part of the country you're in this week. If you're in the southern plains, from Texas up through Oklahoma and into Kansas, you're in the bullseye for the most intense and most prolonged heat. Expect widespread highs well into the 100s, minimal overnight relief, and an extended stretch, potentially close to a week or more, where the heat doesn't let up. This is the kind of stretch where hydration, shade, and limiting outdoor exertion during peak afternoon hours genuinely matter for avoiding heat exhaustion or heat stroke. If you're in the Midwest or Ohio Valley, you're going to see the heat build in behind the initial wave hitting the plains, with temperatures climbing into the 90s and potentially near or above 100 in some spots by the middle of next week. Combined with higher humidity in this region compared to the drier southern plains, heat index values here could end up feeling more oppressive than the raw temperature numbers suggest. If you're in the southeast or Gulf Coast, your primary concern through the weekend is more about rounds of thunderstorms and the flash flood risk that comes with a stalled boundary sitting nearby, plus keeping an eye on Dolly's progress in case that track shifts. The heat dome's influence will still be felt here too as it builds westward through the region, but the more immediate day-to-day concern is the rain and storm potential. If you're in the northern plains or upper Midwest, watch for a mix of both hazards. You'll get periods of building heat as the ridge expands, interrupted by rounds of thunderstorms tied to that wavy frontal boundary dipping down from Canada. Some of those storms have the potential to produce damaging winds and large hail. So it's worth keeping a close eye on daily forecast updates rather than assuming clear skies will hold. And if you're out in the southwest or Intermountain West, the story stays fairly consistent, meaning daily monsoon-driven thunderstorm chances continue, with localized flash flooding the primary risk in areas prone to fast runoff, even while the broader ridge keeps most of the region on the hot and dry side outside of those storm windows. So to wrap this up and put the whole picture together, over the next several days, we've got lingering severe storm chances across parts of the plains, the southeast, and the northern tier, mainly bring damaging wind and hail risks rather than a widespread tornado threat. Layered on top of that, a strengthening and expanding heat dome is going to bring dangerous, prolonged heat from the southern and central plains into the Midwest and South, peaking in intensity as we move through the middle of next week, with limited overnight relief making the heat stress cumulative rather than a one-day event. Out in the tropics, Tropical Storm Dolly remains a system to watch rather than an immediate threat, currently struggling against wind shear, but with some longer-range uncertainty worth tracking. And, looking toward the second week of September, there are early low-confidence signals of a pattern change that could eventually bring cooler air and a shift toward more typical early fall weather, though that's still far enough out that it should be treated as a trend rather than a guarantee. Stay weather aware over the next week, especially if you're anywhere in that core heat zone from the southern plains into the Midwest and South. Keep checking back for updates, because both the exact placement of the heat dome and Dolly's track in the tropics could shift as we get better data over the next few days. A quick word on why this heat dome is more than a routine hot spell. High pressure aloft traps hot air like a lid, and as that air sinks, it compresses and warms further, which is why temperatures under a strong, stationary ridge run well above what sun angle alone would suggest. The longer that lid sits in place, the more the ground itself heats up day after day, which is why heat domes lasting 5+ days tend to produce their most extreme temperatures toward the back half rather than the front. Because this ridge is expanding rather than staying put, the intensity spreads across a much larger population, from the southern plains into the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and South, rather than staying concentrated in one region. It also reinforces drought in the driest zones under it, since sinking air suppresses the storms that might otherwise bring relief. Now, let's go back and put some more specific numbers on this so it's not just an abstract description of hot and dry. As the ridge builds through the weekend, expect afternoon highs in the mid to upper 90s across a good chunk of the central and southern plains, with the hottest pockets, especially in parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, pushing into the low hundreds. As we move into the start of next week, the core of triple-digit heat is expected to expand, with some locations in the southern plains potentially approaching or exceeding 110 degrees on the hottest days. Farther north and east, into Missouri, Illinois, and the Ohio Valley, expect highs climbing from the upper 80s and low 90s early in the stretch into the mid and possibly upper 90s by the middle of next week as the ridge expands in that direction. And because humidity tends to run higher in the Ohio Valley and Mid-South compared to the drier high plains, don't be surprised if heat index values in those areas end up running several degrees above the actual air temperature, especially during the more humid afternoon and evening hours. On the storm side, let's get a little more specific about timing too. Through the weekend, keep your primary attention on the southeast and Gulf Coast for repeated rounds of showers and thunderstorms tied to that stalled boundary, with a secondary area of concern across the northern plains and upper Midwest, where a wavy frontal system dipping down from Canada could spark some strong to locally severe storms, mainly capable of producing damaging wind gusts and large hail. As we move into Monday and Tuesday of next week, watch the central and southern high plains closely, because that's where disturbances riding along the northern edge of the heat dome are most likely to interact with the hot, humid, unstable air sitting underneath the ridge, creating the ingredients for stronger thunderstorms capable of significant wind damage, and in any storms that manage to stay discrete rather than clustering together quickly, an isolated tornado risk. By the middle of next week and beyond, the severe weather threat looks like it shifts more toward the fringes of the heat dome rather than its core, meaning areas like the northern plains, parts of the upper Midwest, and potentially the interior Northeast could see periodic rounds of stronger storms as disturbances continue riding along the northern edge of the ridge, while the core zone under the heat dome itself stays largely dry, since sinking air within a dome actively suppresses thunderstorm development. That's actually one of the counterintuitive things about heat domes. The areas experiencing the most extreme heat are often the least likely to get any storm relief, precisely because the same atmospheric setup that's driving the heat is also shutting down the conditions storms need to form. Practically speaking, that means most of the severe weather headlines through the back half of next week will keep coming out of the northern and western edges of the ridge rather than from Texas, Oklahoma, or the Ohio Valley, even though those are the places seeing the worst of the heat itself. One more note on Dolly. Model guidance right now favors a weaker outcome, with the system struggling against shear as it nears the Lesser Antilles, but a smaller share of models show it surviving long enough to reach less hostile waters farther west, near the Bahamas or Florida, where it could reorganize. That spread is exactly why it's a watch and wait system rather than a dismiss it situation, so keep half an eye on updated advisories through the middle of next week. On the heat safety side, it's worth knowing the difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat exhaustion looks like heavy sweating, weakness, cold or clammy skin, a fast but weak pulse, and nausea. Getting to a cooler place, loosening clothing, and sipping water helps. Heat stroke is a medical emergency. Body temperature above 103, hot, dry, or damp skin, a rapid, strong pulse, confusion or loss of consciousness. That calls for immediate emergency help while you try to cool the person down. A few habits make a real difference during a stretch like this. Shift strenuous outdoor activity to early morning, wear light, loose clothing, drink water ahead of thirst rather than waiting for it, and check on neighbors or relatives without reliable air conditioning, since a large share of heat deaths in events like this happen indoors, not outside. The same goes for pets. Hot pavement can burn paws within seconds, and a parked car can reach dangerous temperatures within minutes, even with windows cracked, so never leave kids or animals inside one. As we look toward the tail end of this pattern and into the transition that might be waiting in the wings for the second week of September, it's worth remembering that these long-range signals, while genuinely useful for planning purposes, come with real uncertainty attached. A hint of a stronger cold front and a pattern change and 2-week model guidance is a trend worth watching, not a locked-in forecast you should build firm plans around just yet. As we get closer, forecasters will have a much clearer picture of whether that transition actually verifies, how strong any resulting cold front might be, and whether it brings just a brief cool down or a more significant shift toward autumn-like conditions. Either way, the fact that we're even seeing hints of a pattern change this early is a reminder that we are, in fact, approaching the seasonal turn, even if the immediate week ahead is dominated by some of the most intense heat we've seen so far this year. So here's the bottom line heading into the next 7 to 10 days. Expect a dangerous, expanding heat dome to dominate the pattern across the southern and central plains, the Midwest and the South, with widespread highs in the upper 90s to around 110 degrees in the hardest hit areas. Minimal overnight relief and elevated heat index values, especially in more humid zones. Layered around the edges of that heat, expect continued rounds of thunderstorms across the southeast, the northern plains, and the southwest, with damaging wind and hail as the primary severe weather concerns, rather than a widespread tornado threat. Keep a loose eye on Tropical Storm Dolly in the Atlantic, currently fighting unfavorable conditions, but worth monitoring, given some spread in the long-range track guidance. And know that there are early, low-confidence signals of a pattern change and cooler air arriving around the second week of September, which would mark a genuine step toward fall, though that's still far enough out to treat as a trend rather than a promise. Stay safe out there over the next week, keep checking for updates as this pattern evolves, and take the heat seriously if you're anywhere in that core zone stretching from the southern plains up into the Midwest and South. This is a fast-moving picture in 2 directions at once. A heat dome that's still expanding and a tropical system whose track is still uncertain, so the details here will keep sharpening over the next few days as new model runs and updated advisories come in.